let's get started, and people can kind of join in. In case you can't read my little name there, I'm Sue Rockwell. I'm co-chair of the book group, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you tonight. Whether this is your first time with us or whether you've been with us since the beginning, which was the fall of 2000. So 20 years we've been going, guys. Anyway, we are very pleased to have you with us. And I just wanted to mention that the last time I was at a public function, BP, before pandemic, was on March 10th when I was at Cary Library listening to Serena Zabin. So this is kind of deja vu all over again. Looking forward to tonight, especially. So before we get started, let's take a few minutes and let Sarah Mcdonough, our programs manager, tell us the rules of the game tonight. Sarah?
Sure. So, hi, everyone. I'm Sarah. I see mostly familiar faces here tonight, but a couple new people. Thank you. Welcome. So I just wanted to let anyone know who didn't hear me mention it before. I did mute everyone who is coming into the meeting this evening because we are going to have a little bit of back and forth between our co-chairs and Serena before we get into the meat of the discussion. And there are also a couple people who are going to be coming and going over the course of the meeting. So just in the interest of eliminating background noise, when it gets to the point in the discussion where we can start talking more freely, it will probably be most useful if you either use one of the little reaction buttons that Zoom has available to sort of raise your hand and say that you'd like to speak. And you'll see those if you hover your mouse around, normally either the bottom or the top of the screen. Mine, it's on the bottom. And if that doesn't work, you can always physically raise your hand. I just don't want anybody's arms to get tired. And then when I call on you, I can either ask to unmute your microphone, or you can do that yourself by right-clicking on your little box here on Zoom. So hopefully, fingers crossed, everything will technologically go all right tonight. I think that's pretty much it.
Okay, are we ready? Can everybody hear me okay?
Take it away, Joan.
Okay, thumbs up. So here we go. On the evening of March 5th, 1770, Captain Thomas Preston and a small contingent of British redcoats under his command fired into a crowd of civilians massing on King Street in Boston, killing several people. We are all, being Lexingtonians and Dedhamites, we are all familiar with Paul Revere's engraving of the Bloody Massacre. But what about those connections between Bostonians and the British Army? Tonight, we welcome Dr. Serena Zabin, author of The Boston Massacre, A Family History, her newest work. Dr. Zabin is professor of early America and director of the program in American Studies at Carleton College in Northfield, Minnesota, where she is zooming in from Minnesota. Let's begin, Serena. Let's talk about your title. What does it mean to write about the Boston Massacre in terms of a family history?
Oh, well, first, let me say thank you so much for having me. Also, I want to make sure everyone can hear me fine. It's all good. So thank you for having me back. It's lovely to be so supported by what I still feel is sort of my local historical society. So the Boston Massacre as a family history is, I think, a way of thinking about an event, as you said, that Revere engraving that we all think we know really well. And then as soon as we start thinking, well, actually, this is about family, we start to see something else altogether. And so one of the reasons I called it that was to help shake us up from the story that we think we already know, which is the story that Revere told us and which we continue to see over and over and over again, when really there's a much more complicated and I think much more interesting story about what was the relationship between colonial Massachusetts and Imperial Britain. We can learn about what that
Great.
relationship really is through these families. I should end with that.
I liked your book because you introduced a lot of really great characters, and I love characters. Who did you fall in love with mostly? And then who was your least favorite person? So two sides to that coin.
All right, two sides to that coin. So, I mean, I think, let's see, there's two different ways to talk about falling in love, maybe, right? So I was most moved, I guess I'd say, by Jane Chambers, who's the woman who opens the book. Partly because it was such a pleasure to be able to trace her over, 3 continents nearly, or certainly 3, what are now countries, what felt like all across the Atlantic. And she was a woman that I felt I could kind of identify with a little bit. She had these children. She was just doing her best to try to keep her family together in a world that she felt really was pretty much out of her control. She couldn't do a lot with what she had, but she really fought to keep her family alive. And I found that really moving. And then at one point, after I had found her in a number of records, I was in the Boston Public Library back when it was open and came across these scraps of receipts really from the Boston Selectmen. And the one was for the burial of a soldier's child. And it was clear from putting together some other pieces of her story that actually this was one of her children. And I actually sat there in the BPL and I had tears in my eyes. I really felt that this was the moment that she and I connected across the ages. So in that way, I did sort of fall in love with her, or I felt really connected to her. I mean, the person I really enjoyed the most, of course, is that, our fabulous soldier, whose name has just this second escaped my memory, William Clark, right? Who is such a rake, and he's got this kind of literary bent. He's clearly incredibly obnoxious and incredibly appealing. And I just found him so much fun to kind of hang out with. Oh, and now I'm supposed to talk about who I don't
and
like.
Who? Yes.
Who I
and
don't
I think
like.
I know who, but you mentioned it.
All right. Well, so I really try hard as I think about people in the past to appreciate the fact that they are complicated people and we can't know all of their lives, and that many of them are not really out to do harm, although many of them do, right? And so I was able to like, a lot of these officers who really, I think probably were jerks, but I also felt were sort of doing their best. The person, and I'm so embarrassed to say this, and I know this is being recorded, but I'll say it anyway, the person that I really just have a hard time with is John Adams. He just, the way that he shapes that final story, right, where he essentially throws Crispus Attucks and all other people of African descent, all these people of indigenous descent, poor people, young people, he throws them all under the bus to save his, beloved city, or what was then a town. I just have a hard time with that. So I got to say, I'm just not a fan.
So are there some future stories coming with people who did not make the book that you would really like to delve more research into?
The one that I'm really dying to do actually is someone who just gets a sentence at the very end in the epilogue. So Hannah Flucker's sister, who marries a British officer in the 14th Regiment named James Urquhart. And she and Hannah write back and forth. She writes a bunch still to Henry Knox. She has property in Maine from her parents that she's trying to get a hold of even after the revolution. But she and Urquhart leave. They go back first to England and then to Scotland. And there, apparently, she has a number of affairs and he sues for divorce in the Scottish courts. And I just pretty recently got hold of the divorce papers, which seem to lay out their relationship and all of the other people that she met. And they end up with a divorce and she remarries. And that's not a story that we often think about for the 18th century. So I'm eager to dig further into that one.
Very good. We know that the massacre happens during a standoff. Can you talk about the eyewitness accounts and maybe give us a few ideas about some of the things that stood out the most for you in your research about the eyewitness accounts?
So there is this moment in March, and and as our own days are getting darker and colder, and I know y'all just had some snow, right? And as there are fewer and fewer cars out on the streets, you can start to imagine maybe a little better what 18th century Boston was like. I mean, there are no street lights, right? The first street lights come to Boston actually on the same shipment as the tea that ends up being dumped into the harbor. So we're still, nearly 4 years out from any street lights in Boston. And so it's really dark. And one thing that I've been really reflecting on and thinking about, actually, as I've been working on this computer game, which I'm happy to talk about later too, if people would like, is how poorly anyone can see and how your eyes kind of play tricks on you in, this kind of half light when light is reflecting off the snow or coming out of windows. And so, as I think about all of the eyewitness accounts about what it is that people said they saw, right? I think that many people, not everyone, but many people are, again, trying to speak fairly honestly about what they saw, though they're shading, so to speak, what they thought they saw, how many people, the feeling of the crowd, but that really, it's almost impossible to see very much, right? And so we've taken these accounts as though it's like noon on a sunny day in June, but it's not like that. It's dark. And so all these things that people say they saw, it's very hard to imagine that they could see very much.
So what did you find were the greatest inaccuracies in the story of the massacre? What do you think historians have missed in this story of this bloody massacre?
I mean, I think what they've really missed are the connections between the soldiers and the people on the street that night, right? They actually, many of them knew each other, were connected with each other, right? Had been neighbors, or they're married to people who know each other or who are related to each other. And so what people have really missed, I think, in and this is because of Revere, is they've missed the feeling of what it was like to be out there that night. Yes, it was chaotic. Yes, it was scary. I mean, there's people with guns and bayonets and shouting and people throwing. I'm not going to say it wasn't scary, but also it was a lot more known than we think of, right? That people look around at each other and they know each other. And that's the piece that gets lost when we think of it as just a conflict between British and Americans, or soldiers and civilians.
Good. What surprises did you find while you were doing your research? What sort of information were you shocked or surprised by?
I mean, honestly, the biggest one is just that the story was there and that no one told it. Like, that to me was the most amazing thing. I didn't have to dig that hard. I mean, at some point, of course, as I went down lots of rabbit holes and that was fun. But the very first day that I was in the archives in Massachusetts at the Massachusetts Historical Society before lunch, I mean, which is amazing given that, I had little kids and I hardly even got to the archive before lunch, that I found, I think, 3 marriage records in the church records between soldiers and civilians. And I thought, this stuff is just sitting here. The story is so obvious. I couldn't understand why no one had told it before. And so to me, the most surprising thing was how it was all just lying there in plain sight.
Wow. Do you think, with your thoughts now, do you think that there was any way that this bloodshed could have been avoided?
Yeah, maybe not deliberately. Yes. Okay. So I'd say, how do I say this? That there were a couple of moments that it absolutely could have been avoided. So in the summer of 1769, when two of the regiments sailed back to Halifax, that would have been a great moment to bring everyone back to Halifax. That was an idea that was on the table. It certainly would have ended everything. And then for several months into the fall, in fact, the generals and some of the other higher ranking officers are pleading to be able to take the soldiers away, right? They are they're anticipating that there's going to be a problem, because it's so likely when soldiers are used for urban policing in the 18th century, the likelihood of bloodshed is extremely high. It happens almost all the time. And so all of these officers are like, please, could we end this now? And really, first, Governor Bernard, and then after he leaves, Lieutenant Governor Hutchinson refused to actually let the army leave. So there were a number of moments. Do I think that there was something that really happened between these particular guys and the particular people on the street? No, I think that's just bad luck. It's sort of, I think I call it roll the dice in the book. There were other moments that there might have been shootings and didn't, right? Like, you look like everything's going to tip over and then it doesn't. And then you think it's going to and it doesn't. And this was the moment that it did.
Very good. And then in the epilogue, Civil War, the quote that I want you to talk a little bit about, where you say, we think of the American Revolution as a political event, but it was much more like a bad divorce. I love that. Can you kind of give us a little bit more on that?
Yes. So I think of it as really the history, right, of connection between people, right, gets forgotten in a bad divorce, right, and it gets and that history gets rewritten, I think somebody helped me come up with that phrase, but I came up with it in part because, I actually was watching this happen with some other people in my circle and thinking, I remember when you two were friends, right? And I think we've all had that experience as we've watched people go through divorces, right? And they're like rewriting history and you're like, no, that's not totally how I remember it. And I think that part of what happens, of course, is people look into the past and their present emotions sort of flood their picture of that past. And that, I think, is really what's going on with the story. That's why that story was just lying there in plain sight. And already, I mean, before all the soldiers are gone, they start erasing, and not completely, but through the 1770s, and then really as the first stories of the revolution are picked up and are written, the first histories, it really becomes hardened as this moment that this is the first bloodshed of the revolution. This is the moment that we all should have known that it was all going to go south. Well, that's not really what was going on.
Wow. So before I open up the questions or comments about the book to our audience, can you talk a little bit about your video game, Witness to the Revolution? It sounds really interesting. I've a little plug for you for future.
Yes. We're actually hoping, I mean, depending on so many things around this pandemic, but that soon after we're all, released back into normal life, that we will try a short version playtest at the Old State House and the Revolutionary Spaces. So we will certainly keep you posted. So Witness to the Revolution is a kind of immersive three-dimensional video game that allows people to kind of play out some of the characters that you meet in the book. So right now I'm working with a colleague at Carleton, and actually we've got a new partnership with some really impressive people at the University of Wisconsin Stout, both a couple of faculty members and a number of students working with us. And the foundation of the game was built by a lot of Carleton students over the last 5 or 6 years, and now we've sort of moved it over to Stout. But the first couple of episodes that we're playing with are kind of trial ones. One is takes place at the Royal Exchange Tavern, and you kind of play Jane Whitehouse, whom you all may remember is not yet Jane Whitehouse. You play her as Jane Crothers, and she does a bunch of things that you have to try to do. She makes flip. She attempts to participate in some of that kind of informal economy where she's sort of lifting some soldiers' clothes and trying to sell them on the black market without being caught. And then, so you have a couple of little quests you try to get through, and then you see the shooting from her perspective, right? And likewise, there's another one that we're working on with Thomas Wilkinson, whom you may remember is also on the street that night. And his is kind of a maze one, because you might remember he's sort of trying to figure out how can he get to a place where he can see, and he goes to try to find his neighbor soldier. He's like, what's going on here? So that one, and you have to use the fire pump because he's one of the people who comes out thinking that there's going to be a fire. And one of the things that's really interesting about playing both of these games, I mean, you both have these like little mini games where you're just trying to do a task, and which I'll talk about in a moment. But what's interesting from a kind of serious perspective is as you try to figure out what each of them saw, you realize, of course, they saw very different things. They tell you this in their testimony. And as you try to move them around the space of Boston, you can see how little they could see, right? How many people are in their way, how dark it is. In fact, at the moment of the shooting, right, Wilkinson seems to sort of turn away, right? In that moment that you don't want to see what's going on, you're kind of blinded. And then the viewer actually can't really completely see either, right? And the idea is that you play enough of these and you start to see all these different perspectives, and it repopulates the Revere engraving, right? It starts to change what that Revere engraving looks like. You start moving people around, you start adding other people to the scene. So by the end, after you play 5 or 6 people, the engraving looks really totally different. We came up with the mini games really because we tested this version on a bunch of children, including my own, who told me it was not fun. And so now we're working on trying to make the whole thing more fun. And so that's part of what we do.
That's very good. Keep us posted.
I will, absolutely. I think it's going to be great.
So comments, questions, and answers. I'm going to turn it back to Sarah. Please either raise your hand or put it in the chat box so that we can continue our wonderful conversation with Serena on her book.
All right. I know I just looked at the bottom there, so I don't know how many different types of little hand signals you have. I'm just seeing a thumbs up and a thumbs down. So if anyone who doesn't have their camera on, feel free to use those if you'd like. And then I see, Margaret, did you have a question? Feel free to also raise your physical hand as well, whatever works best.
There, unmute now. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
You can hear me.
Yes.
Okay. My question, I should know this, it's elementary. Tell me something. I actually have 2. The simple question, who is the patriot who defended the British soldiers? Was that John Adams?
There's a couple of them. I mean, there's Adams and also Josiah Quincy, right? Who works closely with him. Yep.
And then my next question is about Crispus Attucks. Was he a slave? Was he a freed black man? I feel I should know.
No.
I guess I could go to Wikipedia, but I'd rather hear you tell.
You know what? Honestly, the reason you don't know is because we don't know that much about his life, right? And so it's sort of conflicted. So you shouldn't feel bad that you don't know. In fact, it's a little hard to say. What we believe we know about Attucks is that he was formerly enslaved, that he escaped. We do have a newspaper advertisement that the person who claimed him as a slave put in the Boston papers looking for him. He's from Natick, probably partially, probably his mother was indigenous, right? And his father was African descended. And then certainly he spent some time as a sailor, right? And then he's back in Boston with a ship and a bunch of sailors. And that, I think, is about as much as we're sure we know about him. After that, there's a lot of conjecture. And I will say there's a really spectacular online exhibit that the Old State House has up called something like, I don't know, Revealing Attucks, Getting to Know Attucks, something like that. They've got a big Attucks museum exhibit up online where I think pretty much you can see as much as we know. Right? I think they've really tried to.
There are many parts to their story too. They've done like X number of parts to it.
Well, thank you. That's very helpful.
Sure.
All right, Mary?
I just had a comment, Serena. You said that the story was hiding in plain sight and you couldn't imagine why no one had talked about it. Well, I think it perhaps is a woman's perspective. I was thinking of Laura Thatcher Ulrich, who picked up the Diary of Martha ballad in the Maine Historical Society that male historians had walked by for years and years and never gave it a second thought. And she wrote that book, A Midwife's Tale, based on that. So I think the fact that you are a very observant, talented woman had a lot to do with your finding this story, where male historians would say, oh, family, oh, I'll go for the big stuff like the war.
So thank you for the compliment. Maybe I should start there. I will say that A Midwife's Tale absolutely was inspiring for me. And when I wrote the kind of pitch for the book, I said, I see this book as a kind of mashup is probably what I said, but mix between another really wonderful book called The Woman's War by Stephanie McCurry, which is really about the Civil War, but about the ways in which paying attention to women helps us rethink a very military history, and A Midwife's Tale, right? Which is very much about what happens when we pay attention to the everyday, to the things that we have overlooked, right? To the quotidian, right? The stuff that we think is uninteresting, receipts, how regiments got moved around the British Empire. Turns out that looking at those ships' manifests is really revealing, right? But it seems like it's going to be tedious. And that's the same thing with Midwife's Tale. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, having gone down into the archives a lot myself, it's always fascinating to me the number of times that someone says something has been discovered when it was really nicely shelved and documented where it was supposed to be in an archive, and no one had just looked at it for that particular piece of information before.
Yeah.
As you said, a lot of these things are hiding in plain sight and people just overlook it because they think it's not historically important.
Right. In fact, I kind of came across the story, the whole thing in the first place, because I was reading a short narrative, which, as you all will recall, was, published in 1770 and, has been kind of kicking around ever since. And it happens that Carleton has an original copy in the special collections. And I brought down a class to look at it for years. I mean, year after year, and I read it with them. And finally, I looked at that very first deposition, which is the one when a soldier's wife is described as saying that, she would put a stone in her handkerchief and beat those rebels' brains out if something were to happen. And it took me years, honestly, of reading that and teaching those depositions before I thought, who is the soldier's wife? And do soldiers have wives? And I don't know what I thought, but I really don't, I mean, stuff that was truly obvious, it really just took a moment of stopping and saying, I don't know what's going on here, right? And then suddenly that's what opens up the questions.
Any other questions or comments?
The one thing that I never thought of that you brought out in the book was the decisions that these soldiers had to make as far as, you know, what was going to happen after all of this in Boston. I mean, were they going to stay? Were they going to leave? You know, the decisions they had to make was really quite revealing, because I had never thought about that side of the story.
Yeah, one of the things that I loved most about working on this book is actually I started, which surprised me in some ways, but the first chapter that I really wrote was the one on desertion. Because it seemed to me, once I got into it, that desertion was so revealing, right? Like once you started thinking, oh, desertion is not a military problem, right? Which is how it's, you know, always talked about in any kind of historical literature, it's sort of the problem of desertion. But actually a kind of indication, an index to all kinds of other relationships. It just felt like it opened the whole picture up for me. And there was something about, you know, starting in that unusual place that just helped me think, oh, you know, the story's going to just be here, right? It's all there as soon as I just change the lens a little bit. So yeah, once I realized, oh, desertion is not about people who are irresponsible, right? That's what happens when, if you just read officers on desertion, they're just like, oh my gosh, right? People who desert are men who are too lazy to do the work, right? Well, once you stop thinking like that, you realize, no, this tells us so much about their priorities and about what matters to them, right? And about their families.
Yeah, and also with the christenings and the colonists that supported some of these soldiers when it came down to the nitty gritty. That was something I never thought about either, which was quite revealing.
I saw Paul's hand up earlier. Would you like to go ahead?
Sure. Not so much questions as just a few comments. I will admit I'm a reenactor. And I portray a British soldier, British officer, on the green, and I've participated in the reenactment of the Boston Massacre, and I've sort of been on a 30-year crusade to humanize these people, because they are so often portrayed as either robotic dullards or towering monsters, and depending upon what story you're trying to tell about them, and as they so much say, you know, the victors tend to write the histories, but that what you've managed to do, and you know, I read your book and I was like, I wish I'd written this, because you've cracked open the myth, and that kind of long, you know, the myth of that the American Revolution was inevitable, and it was just, you know, it started here and it just proceeded, you know, from A to B to C to D, and it didn't. And your analogy of this being a divorce is absolutely spot on. It's a divorce. Read the Declaration of Independence. It's a breakup letter, you know. And then also that these people all knew each other. They referred to each other by name. They're yelling at each other by name. They're not strangers. And the regiment I'm in, the 10th Regiment, was up in the Great Lakes. They weren't invaders. You know, they were brought into Boston. They were portrayed as invaders, but you've nailed it. You've gotten it all the way through. So I realize this is a big blurb and a comment rather than a question, but you seem to be enjoying it, so I just thought I would share.
No, thank you. I know, I think, and I know Sarah's a reenactor too. And, you know, I mean, one of the things that I've come to learn, I mean, my first book, you know, which was about a suspected slave conspiracy in which, you know, more people are executed than die in Salem. And it's, you know, a horrible, far more depressing book. Nobody reenacts unsurprisingly, right? So the world of reenactors was one that I really only got to know as I worked on this and as I became friendly with the people at Revolutionary Spaces and elsewhere. And so I really came to learn something about the extent of the research that people do, right, into their people, and which I found so, so impressive, right? Like that I'm trying to get to know a lot of people and their relationships to each other. But I occasionally would meet people who really knew some of these folks. And I was like, oh, I hope I have them right, because I felt there are people who've really tried to live them, right? Which is not quite my job as a historian.
Right.
But I wanted other people to know them at least.
Yeah, and you've done an excellent job on that. And I don't know if you're aware, there's an author in Rhode Island named Don Haggist, and he has written a number of semi-biographical books on following these British soldiers around, who they really were. And we have this tendency to imprint our modern sensibilities of an army and everything onto these people, and it doesn't quite work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And in fact, if you dig in the notes, you'll see there was a place really right at the end where Don shared some research with me, which was fabulous. I was sort of trying to get one little thing right, and I thought I can't go to London to check one footnote, but he had it. He was very generous. Yeah.
Well, I'm about 2/3 of the way through.
Well, check the notes. You'll find his name in there.
Richard, go ahead.
One thing that comes with visitors is often when you talk about the wounded British that were left behind and a lot of the prisoners of war, someone will occasionally say, well, what happened to them? And occasionally it's like, well, they are in the neighborhood, depending upon where they are. The wounded are here. And the other thing is, of course, you're looking at conscripted soldiers for the most part. Why would they want to go back to Britain where they had nothing? Whereas here they had a chance that they could meet someone, they could start a family, they could have land, and they could be better than they were at home. And talking about, the relation between them, it's sort of obvious that, considering how small Boston was at the time and they're mingling among each other, it's the same throughout the countryside. So you've got these people who are mingling, and finally it's like, this is what I want. I do not want to go home. I want to stay here.
Yeah, I think, that piece has been one of the biggest challenges, I think, of thinking about desertion, right, is that there are so many different explanations for it, right? All of which have some truth to them, right? Like, so really officers were afraid of exactly what you said, right? They're like, oh, this is going to look a lot better to them than what we have to offer, right? And so then they sort of tried to convince themselves, well, people will be happy to leave now, but as soon as the harvest is over and farmers aren't going to pay them anymore, they'll come crawling back, right? They'll see that this is not going to be the place for them, which sometimes is true, right? Like, they're not always wrong, the officers. Likewise, Sons of Liberty write these things, are like, well, this place is like, the land of milk and honey, right? So like, of course people would want to stay in Massachusetts. Who wouldn't, right? And, that's not entirely true. And every once in a while they try to convince some people to desert and it doesn't work, right? So you're right that there's something appealing about staying, but the majority of people, of course, don't see it that way. They make a life in the army, right? They have friends, they have families. Sometimes they've got children who continue in the same regiment, and they're not, as somebody did point out in the chat, and it's quite right, at least in this moment, they are not conscripted. And in fact, even though it is kind of formally speaking a lifetime enlistment, it's not difficult to get out of it, right? If you in the right moment, if you ask the right way, you actually can can get out if, especially the army doesn't really want you at that moment. So, you know, so soldiers are making choices, right? And they're balancing knowns and unknowns, right? And what I found, at least in 1770 and 1772, is that, you know, meeting and marrying into a local family was pretty much the strongest reason for anyone to stay, right? But on the other hand, there are Massachusetts people who decide to leave with the army, right? Decide it's better to go with them. So that happens too.
Yeah, I think all these disparate choices just, again, proves how human they are.
Yeah.
And you never know what choice someone is going to make. And particularly when you have some people who are career soldiers and some people who aren't necessarily. I'm always surprised the number of people who had previous occupations before joining the army. I think there was a guy, I may be conflating a bunch of different people, but we went to a symposium earlier in the spring, and I think there was a person who was listed as killed on the battle road, but it turned out that he had just passed out from shock, and the person standing next to him said, "Oh, he's dead," and left him. And then eventually he woke up all alone on the side of the road, and I think he stayed in Concord and just got a job.
All right. I like that story. That's a very John Bell story.
I think John Bell's the one who told it to me. So
Yes. Okay. It's a very John Bell story. Yes.
Again, I may be more than one person that I'm combining there, but I think there was at
I'll
least
have to look for it.
in Concord that he had just discovered.
Yeah.
Serena, did you have a hard time finding out what was going on in the suburbs? What were people interested in outside of Boston? Did you have a hard time finding information about that?
You know, I didn't dig as deeply as I might have. So, you know, I spent a little time like in Framingham, right? Because one of those, the one, you know, person that this one was another one of these really touching ones, right? Who the one guy who's actually shot for desertion, right, on Boston Common, takes off for, I think it's Framingham, where near there, where his family is, and or at least that's where he's found. And so I did a little looking there, and I spent a little bit of time in other parts of Suffolk County trying to make sense of some of the jurors, right, and what their lives looked like and what kinds of connections they had. But it was often a little harder to figure out what sense they made of having soldiers in Boston, because people who tended to write about it actually tended largely to be very political, right? They tended to be Sons of Liberty. So they said exactly what you'd think they would say, which I found not terribly interesting.
Sure. Any other questions or comments from anyone? Nancy's got her hand up.
I had always believed that the soldiers who were housed in Boston were told that, you know, people were told these soldiers are going to be staying with you and you're going to put up with it. And it now appears, reading this, that people were paid to have them stay there, and that when they left, they lost the source of income. They must have been a little upset. Am I wrong? When they came back, they obviously, the soldiers came back later. Did they move into houses? Did they ever just live there?
Yeah. So one of the things, yeah, you're complete. All of that is completely right. So yes, the Army, you know, and this actually was one of my favorite things to put together, because I think it has been confusing even for professional historians for a long time. And somebody did write a book called Quarters just a year or two ago. And that helped me think about this also. But until then, I think people were like the Quartering Act, there they were, you know, and there was some understanding that there was some money passing hands, but people were not paying much attention to what was going on there. And so you're right. I mean, there's stuff, I can't remember if it made it into the book or not, where people are saying, oh, you know, there's a guy who's renting out some of his sister's empty houses to officers. He's like, yeah, sorry, they left and they're sitting empty. I'm trying to find a new renter for you. But right now, don't expect any income from those 2 houses. Right. So you're completely right. They leave. People are like, oh, we lost some money there. But then when they come back initially in 72, they all stay out in the barracks, right? And out in Castle Island. And then after the tea is dumped in the harbor, right? You may remember the response to the dumping of the tea is what comes to be called the Intolerable Acts, right? But that are the coercive acts. And they do a number of things. They close the port of Boston until the tea is paid for. They they do a bunch of stuff to the administration of Massachusetts, right? You can only have a town meeting once a year unless the governor calls for more, things like that. And then they pass 2 acts also. Parliament passes 2 acts, and I actually don't think people have really noticed this sufficiently, that really are a response to, I think, what they saw as the administrative holes that allowed 1768 to happen. So one of them is they say any magistrate or soldier who is accused of a capital crime will be tried back in England. No more of this colonial court business, right? And they rewrite the Quartering Act to say that actually soldiers can be quartered in private homes. But they don't do that till 74, right? And it's a response to the tea. Clearly it's meant to be a response to the tea, but it also, I think, and I have to find out who actually wrote the act. I haven't gone back and dug very far. But it seems to me those 2 acts together are really about what happened when somebody looked at what happened in 68 and they were like, oh, we're not doing this again, right? 68 and 70. We're gonna fix those loopholes.
So in 74, they would not be paid for quartering them.
No.
So that's what I remember.
Yep. So when they come back in 74,
yeah,
right, they're taking spaces. I don't know, to the best of my knowledge, really, they're mostly out in the island, out in Castle Island, until we start getting to the siege, right? I don't think they're really living in private homes until after Lexington, but I'd have to look, and I think that in small numbers they certainly are, but I don't think they're taking over spaces until the siege of Boston.
Okay.
When that happened, do you think there would have been a higher concentration of abandoned houses that they could have taken over?
Yeah, but they're also they are moving in the army, but even though they have the right, it's often kind of negotiated. You see it in Philadelphia when the army, occupies Philadelphia during the war, right? There's a lot of negotiating. People are like, I don't think I really want soldiers in my house. And the army's saying, well, that's too bad. And well, okay, if I have to have them, I want these ones, right? I mean, there's some space still for working it out.
You have enough money, you can get anything you want.
Some of it is money, some of it is status, some of it is just stubbornness. We definitely see some of that too.
Yeah, I was just thinking about places like Newport that were invaded by every army in existence pretty much.
Right.
And with the huge influx of people leaving town over time, that as each new country's army swept in, it seemed like there were more and more available spaces because people had just hightailed it off the island entirely.
Yeah, I mean, the population of Boston just plummets, right? I mean, when the siege is over, there's it's like a ghost town.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Is there any more questions in the chat box or?
Let's see, I'm not seeing anything popping up, but if anyone would like to speak, go ahead.
Anyone else have any comments or questions for Serena?
Actually, I do.
Great.
I'm not on video, so excuse my rudeness. I'm having a bad hair day.
That's okay. Speak
Um,
on.
Professor Zabin, I'm curious to know what led you to choose early American history. Was it something, did you discover it in your childhood and you fell in love with it, or what was it that, was there a spark?
Yeah, I mean, what a question. So there's a piece of it that feels a little overdetermined, right? I mean, I grew up, I hope you all see my parents up there in Vox. I grew up in Lexington. They're still in the house that I grew up in, right? I too was brought to, the Green every year, right? Multiple times a year. I distinctly remember, people reading me Sam the Minuteman as I sat there in third grade or whatever it was. So there's a piece of it, like, why not? But I didn't start there as an academic, and really, actually, to go back to that earlier point, some of it was about reading Midwife's Tale, which I read. I started my academic life as a classicist, and I was in Italy. And I think, if I can out my mother, that she had read it in 1992 for book club. And as maybe many of you all did, it was such a book club book. And I was about to go to Italy, and I was just looking for paperbacks to bring with me in English. And so I grabbed that and I read it on a train. And I was captivated, and I really thought, oh my gosh, I think I'm in the wrong place. I think I'm not meant to be in this gorgeous Italian dry countryside. I'm meant to be in Maine in March with the river rising and a lot of mud, right? And so I did have what I came to realize as I became an early American historian. I had kind of what felt like a conversion experience, right? I think that there are people, I think that there are people who in the 18th century would have recognized it as that. So, some of it is I was sort of brought into this moment. And then I was kind of fascinated by the amount of stuff that's left in the 18th century, right? It's not like working on 20th century history where there's so much material, right, that it's hard to even know where to start, and it's certainly hard to know where to stop. I mean, one of the joys of the 18th century is the challenge of figuring out, how do we get around the problem of what gets saved, right? And really what gets saved for the 18th century has everything to do with the stories that people in the 19th century told about their past, right? So as, especially historical societies and other people, particularly in Massachusetts and Virginia, right, are sort of duking it out to say, where is the birthplace of liberty? Certain things get kept, right? And that's one reason really why, the records are so good in Massachusetts and not good in New York, which is where my first book was set. New York decided it wasn't going to be part of that particular competition. And so those 18th century records are terrible. But that was a really interesting challenge for me as well.
Well, thank you.
Anyone else out there have any questions, comments?
That just kind of put a spark in my brain. Again, I was reading some documents earlier today with our archivist, and we were trying to decipher some of Reverend Clark's writings and a lot of fun things there. But I'm curious, with all that you've dug up, is there anything that you were really surprised got saved?
Surprised kind of, or thrilled, I don't know what the word is actually receipts. And when you think about it, it's not maybe that surprising, right? That things about money do tend to be kept. But I couldn't believe that, so many of the armies, like just receipts, little scraps of paper where they're like, yeah, I paid, whatever, £3, 6 shillings for this load of wood. But they might have mentioned who they bought it from, right? Which turns out to be really interesting. And you think, why did you bother with the actual little slip of paper? Right? Like, and then it gets recorded, it goes in the ledgers, and I'm not surprised the ledgers are kept, but I was a little surprised the scraps were left, right? So both from the Army, which was amazing. And then, as I said, some of these selectmen records that are just kind of moldering away in the BPL, that stuff was pretty incredible to me. You know, and they're literally truly scraps. I mean, people are saving the paper, so it's little. Yeah, so that I found amazing, right? Not that we have John Rowe's diary, that's not a surprise, although it's a pleasure. But that we have stuff that nobody really thought was important.
How about your digital mapping? Was that of use? And can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So the digital mapping started because as I was coming across, I mean, the very beginning, right? I'm looking at the church records and finding this evidence of soldiers and civilians making, you know, what I call these fictive families or sometimes real families, but especially the baptisms. I thought, well, like, what was the connection between them, right? Like, why these soldiers? Why these Bostonians? And so I wondered if proximity could tell me something, right? I'm like, well, maybe it's their neighbors. I don't know. You know, maybe it's their landlord they're asking. So, so I actually did start with a map that I stuck pins in, and actually somebody came and looked at it. She was like, that is really ridiculous. She's like, you could just have a map and we could actually geo-rectify it. This is before the BPL did this for their map. So I had a student actually take this beautiful 1769 map of Boston and kind of digitally stretch it over, you know, essentially a Google map, a contemporary map. And because there are, you know, some of the streets have moved, but there's enough stone buildings left that haven't moved, right? You get a fairly accurate map. And I started putting people on it, right? So I put on it all the stuff I could figure out, where soldiers were living, where I knew all the taverns were, as much as I could figure out where, you know, ordinary people were living. You know, what came out of it, unsurprisingly, is that there wasn't very good overlap between the data I had about who lived where and the data I had about who was in the churches, right? So it turned out that I did all that work and it didn't really show me, it didn't answer the question, right, of, you know, why these people. And then what I got interested in, and actually it's still something that I think will show up in the game, is, you know, once you start to think about who lives where, you start to wonder as you walk the streets, right, who are you waving hi to, right? Who's out on their stoop? Who do you know? And so trying to trace people's paths as they walk through the town of Boston, and whose houses do they stop by and who might they know, that started to be revealing to me. That helped. And then, you know, really the other piece that helped a lot is, you know, Bostonians did a lot of complaining, and they often complained to the courts about their neighbors. And when they did that, you know, a whole bunch of people would sign these affidavits saying, you know, these people are loud and disorderly. And so then at least I could see who all the neighbors were. And that helped a lot.
Good. Anyone else? Any other comments, questions? We good?
Thank you all so much for reading and engaging. It's such a gift to an author, right? That to have all these things that just kind of live in your head, move out to the page that other people read and take in. And I am really grateful to all of you for engaging.
Well, thank you so much. We have enjoyed this thoroughly and we loved your book. Keep us informed as to what's coming up in the future.
Absolutely, I will. Thank you so much for having me.
And thanks, Mom and Dad, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank
Sue,
you.
I'll turn it back to you. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Well, I just want to add my thanks for a really great book and for your putting a different human perspective on something we thought we knew about. It's always great to see it from a different angle. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and I want to just preview that our next session will be January 12th, and the book is Voyage of Mercy by Stephen Puglio, and he will be with us to lead the book group. I think, if I'm not mistaken, that will be the 6th time that Steve has joined us, and he's always great. The book is terrific. I'm about halfway through it, and if you think we've got it tough now, just dip into this book. You want to see people going through tough times, you'll feel better about where we are, I think. So we hope to see you then. And again, thanks to Sarah for getting us all together technologically, and Joan for doing a great job of helping with the session this evening. And I think that's about it for me. Sarah, you have any last words?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you all so much. I'm really looking forward to the next one. My copy just arrived from the library today, so I haven't started it yet. But I am very excited. That's going to be on the 12th of next month, and tickets are available now and up until then. So we'll hope to see you next time.
Thanks so much, Serena. Again, we really enjoyed your
Thank you.
conversation.
Yes, I
you.
do.
And
Thanks
happy
all.
holidays, everyone.
Yeah, happy holidays. Stay
Happy
safe and
holidays.
healthy.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.